you have introduced to us the multifaceted aspects of this strategy. And now I would like to call upon Dr. Rocky Intan, who is the researcher from CSIS Indonesia, and he will be talking on the assessing China's economic influence in Indonesia, the case of Jakarta-Bandung, a high-speed rail. He has been specializing on international politics of Southeast Asia and Asia-Pacific. He is now working as the fellow at the CSIS Indonesia. He has been graduating from the MA course from Columbia University. So, Mr. Intan, please.
Allow me to share my screen. Can anybody see my screen?
Okay.
Yes. So thank you again, moderator. And first, regards to Ambassador Sunaga and my fellow speakers and panelists today. Thank you as well to NITS and IDS for organizing this timely workshop. So Hunter started us off with the bigger picture on Southeast Asia and hedging. I would like to zoom in a little bit on Indonesia, where I come from, and how China, one of the great powers, one of the players in the great power competition, actually did this.
Intan-san, so please change to the, yeah.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, maybe.
Is it
yeah,
now
correct, yeah.
full screen? Okay, great. So now, firstly, on the trade picture, I mean, I wouldn't go in detail about this, but we all know the trade picture for Indonesia and Southeast Asia and China is pretty similar. China has been the top trading partners for Southeast Asia and Indonesia, especially ever since the signing of the ASEAN-China Free Trade Agreement. And the same picture actually is similar towards Chinese investments in Indonesia. Chinese investments in Indonesia mostly dominate in terms of infrastructure and transport, and the particularly large investment we see in 2015 is for the aforementioned, the case study I'm going to use here is on the Belt and Road Initiative, which is Jakarta-Bandung high-speed rail. So first, on some questions which I will try to attempt to address on my presentation. Firstly, on how has China translated economic ties with Indonesia into making Jakarta's policy preferences conform with theirs. And secondly, how can and what can make Indonesia more resistant in dealing with the indirect or direct Chinese influence so that our policies conform with theirs. So this is basically the outline of my presentation. First, I would like to attempt to establish a framework on how China establishes and conducts economic influence. And second, I would like to zoom in on the very likely channel of China's influence in Indonesia, which is our own state-owned enterprises. And then third, I would use the case of Jakarta-Bandung high-speed rail, the main project on Belt and Road Initiative by China in Indonesia. And lastly, I would like to try to evaluate the influence activities of China in Indonesia through that case. So first, thinking about China and economic influence. International economic influence obviously has been defined as the act of altering one target country's behavior to conform with the host country's preferences. And the influencer country obviously has many resources to do this. And there are many actually pathways to do this: political, economic, social, and security interactions between the host countries and the target countries. There are many tools as well, which we know: rewards, coercion, engagement, and persuasion. But one thing I would like to note on the case of Southeast Asia and Indonesia and China on this case is that essentially there is no need for we assume, for example, in the beginning, that the preferences of the host country and the target country to be different. But what happens if the preferences of those countries are aligned to begin with? So in this case, we will have preference alignment and preference amplification between the host countries and the target country. In the case of China and Indonesia, for example, China as the host country would have preferences on pushing for and deepening strategic interactions with Jakarta, while for target country Indonesia, in receiving foreign direct investment from China, Indonesia would have interest in development purposes, increasing our infrastructure coverage across the country, and secondly, zooming in on our elite preferences, there will also be rent-seeking behavior among our elites. So in this case, preference alignment should be the framework for us to actually evaluate the influence operations between happening in China, in Indonesia with China. So I would like now to zoom in on the likely pathway of China to actually influence activities in operations in Indonesia. We cannot talk about the macroeconomic picture of Indonesia without talking about state-owned enterprises. Our SOEs, state-owned enterprises, have been in the commanding heights of Indonesia's economy ever since its inception. The low averages we see in the late 1990s and the early 2000s was due to 1988 reform, and that was the exception and not the norm. And ever since the start of the COVID administration in 2014, as we see in the graph, it has been trending up back to the long-term averages of around half of our Indonesia's GDP. So understanding the role of SOEs in Indonesia would be crucial to understanding the role of host countries and target countries in influence operations in Indonesia. Now, zooming in on SOEs, zooming in on their own balance sheets and pronouncements of projects, we see that 84 out of 121 Indonesian SOEs have had business dealings with China. In a recent report I did based on the period of 2014 to 2019, and they are mostly based on three activities: export imports, loan, and joint ventures. On export imports, because Indonesia's natural resource dominated economy, it is mostly based on natural resource commodities exports, while on loans, these are mostly dominated by Chinese policy banks, CDB, China Development Bank, and Export-Import Bank of China. And on joint ventures, these are mostly on extractive industries, mostly in energy and infrastructure and transportation. And going deeper into beyond their own activities, I also see the commissioners and directors of people behind these SOEs. And 10 out of 65 of these commissioners and directors of Indonesian SOEs have business backgrounds with ties to China. In the case of export imports, these are mostly on coal exports. And in the case of funding, these are mostly on retail and technology startups. We see a lot of venture capital from China investing in the Indonesia's tech startup scene. And in the case of joint ventures, these are mostly on manufacturing and property and real estate. One thing to note here is on export-import and coal, especially on coal, a lot of these business backgrounds, directors and commissioners, also double as well as people in the cabinet as well. So this will actually meet the influence operations of any other country, especially from China, to be much more salient. Now, moving on specifically to the Jakarta-Bandung high-speed rail, a little bit of background. It is the flagship operation of that Road Initiative from China. It is mostly funded around 78 trillion rupiah, or around 5.6 billion US dollars from CDB. It has got upper budget, but that was the original budget in the beginning. It's a consortium of Indonesian SOEs and Chinese companies, especially our own state-owned rail enterprise, KAI, Kereta Api Indonesia. And then the project initially tried to cut the travel time from Jakarta, the capital city of Indonesia, and Bandung, a very prominent textile city factory in Indonesia, from 3 hours to 46 minutes. The current conventional rail takes around 3 minutes. And as of January 2023, physical construction has been around 84%. Going a little bit into the process of how it has taken place. So initially, the feasibility study on the Jakarta-Bandung high-speed rail was funded by Japan, specifically JICA, in 2011. There was also a famous bidding war between Beijing and Tokyo on this regard. Initially, the project was cancelled out of high costs due to President Jokowi's insistence that it should be borne out not by the state budget. But there was behind the scene, the process of negotiations on the project apparently did not stop. And there was also a highlighted central role by the SOE minister, Rini Sumarno, in specifically advocating for China. And in the end, China won out due to no government funding guarantee. So there was a clause in the agreement that China should not, that Indonesian government should not provide any funding to the project, even though, as we all know, and as events progress, and in the end, the project went over budget, and Indonesian government, in the end, did in fact chip in twice with capital injections to the project. But another considerations for the project to win out for China was that electoral considerations for Jokowi himself. Initially, the feasibility study by Japan in JICA promised the project to finish early, around the earliest at 2022. But electorally for Jokowi, there was consideration because China promised the project to finish by 2019. And this coincided perfectly with Jokowi's re-election. There was a push for this to happen, to be given to China. And in terms of planning and bidding, there was also concern as well for the environmental impact assessment. For the project in Indonesia, environmental impact assessment projects, for the permit, it usually takes around 1.5 years. For the project, it happened unusually fast. The environmental impact assessment happened only around a week. So there were these initial concerns did not get better as the project progressed. Excuse me. And moving on to execution, implement, and implications, these projects, as many other projects in Indonesia, were hampered by land acquisition issues. Now, most realistically, completion happened at the time around 2022, and now in 2023, it's only around 84% complete. There was also lack of spatial planning and coordination between central and government and local governments on this project. There were many stories of local deputies of regencies around the area complaining that they did not know that regencies of their area would be passed by the project. And it was estimated around 25,000 houses in West Java have to be demolished to make way for the project. Fixtures and buildings have not all of them been resolved. And there was also considerations due to project cost cutting for the projects, and stations for the projects have to be moved. So initially, and stations for the projects were in downtown Jakarta and downtown Bandung. But in the end, the end stations have to be moved to outskirts of both Jakarta and Bandung. And this could further decrease the passenger projections for the project. Initially, the project projected they would have 2 million passengers per month initially, but this has been just unrealistic by many observers because even now conventionally, conventional rail between Jakarta and Bandung only have 500,000 passengers per month. So even with this, even initially it has been unrealistic. Now with the moving of the end stations to outskirts of the cities, there were even more concerns for the project. Now, for moving on to evaluations for the project, as an influence activity, it has not been a clear-cut success for China's influence activities, especially on preference amplifications compared to behavior change. As I stated earlier, in this case of Jakarta-Bandung high-speed rail as a BRI influence for operations for China in Indonesia, this is a case of preference amplification because from the very beginning, elites in Indonesia also share the same preferences with China on the project. But Jakarta's, it has not been as well a success for China in making all of its interests aligned with Indonesia because as we see, Indonesia did manage to secure several important clauses. Number one was the lack of a government guarantee, even though it has been changed. But one important thing to note here was Indonesia managed to secure this leverage not because of our own domestic resilience, but due to the existence of another rival bidding from Japan. And in this case, both China and Japan had an interest of advancing strategic sectors, which is high-speed rail, of exporting them to Southeast Asia. It is not very clear that this track record could be replicated to other sectors. It is, for example, in other sectors, the leverage might be switched between the investor and the investment. So this is not a case of domestic resilience for Indonesia. And second, a better marks for Indonesia in the sense on domestic resilience was that Indonesia managed to insert a clause on limiting the number of Chinese workers in the project. So traditionally, as we all know, there are concerns about Chinese workers coming to Indonesia and making sure that the jobs employment from the project is limited. And secondly, for Indonesia, Indonesia has historical sensitivities regarding Chinese workers, especially in relations to Chinese Indonesian minorities within Indonesia. Regarding this, Indonesia, for the Jakarta-Bandung high-speed rail, managed to insert a clause in which China has to limit the number of Chinese workers 1 to 4. So for every one Chinese worker in the Jakarta-Bandung high-speed rail, there has to be 4 Indonesian local workers. And as of January 2023, this ratio of local workers to Chinese workers has been observed and even lower. But another negative mark for Indonesia's domestic resilience was the involvement of politically influential SOEs facilitated by influential middlemen. And this highlights the lack of domestic resilience for Indonesia. As we all know, there are several champions within the government for the Jakarta-Bandung high-speed rail, and this does not necessarily mean translate into Indonesia's best interests. There are several cabinet ministers at the time of the Jakarta-Bandung high-speed rail bidding that clearly advocate for China's behalf, and this highlights the lack of domestic resilience on Jakarta's part. And apart from that, Jakarta's own usual problems in terms of infrastructure construction exacerbate a risk of being exploited in the future for influence operations, and not just by China. Dominance, for example, of local elites preferences and haphazard planning and bidding process, and then lastly, the lack of coordination between local and central government levels. These are risk of rule of law and governance in Indonesia that could be exploited in the future for influence operations and not just by China. So just to sum it all up, this has not been a clear-cut success for China in terms of influence operations. There are good marks and bad marks for both Jakarta and Beijing, but there are also homeworks for Indonesia to actually increase its domestic resilience in order for it to ward off influence operations in the future, not just from China. And with that, I will move on to our other speaker. Thank you very much.
Rocky Intan さん。
Thank you very much, Mr. Rocky Intan. Now, Jakarta-Bandung high-speed rail, Mr. Intan has given us very detailed analysis from the political perspective.